Bikers corner a lone traveler at a rest stop. What he reveals freezes them in place. The low hum of engines cut through the evening air, a steady, ominous vibration that signaled trouble before the headlights even came into view. The highway stretched endlessly into the horizon, the sun melting into a deep crimson against the silhouettes of distant hills. A lone traveler walked along the gravel shoulder, his pace unhurried, his presence almost otherworldly against the fading light. He was an odd sight, long, weathered robes draping his lean frame, a scarf wrapped loosely around his shoulders. His face was partially shadowed by strands of dark hair, and in his hand, he carried a gnarled wooden staff that clicked softly against the pavement with every step. He didn't belong here. And that was exactly why the bikers noticed him. The roar of 7 Harleys filled the air as the gang pulled into the isolated rest stop, their movements slow and deliberate. Leather jackets, steel-toed boots, bandanas tied over weathered faces, the Black Vultures weren't just any gang. They were a pack of predators, and the road was their hunting ground. Vince, the leader, killed his engine first, signaling the others to do the same. The silence that followed was almost eerie. The traveler kept walking. Reed, the youngest of the group, was the first to break the silence. "The hell is that?" Mace, a burly man with a jagged scar across his cheek, let out a low chuckle. "Looks like some kind of monk. Think he's lost?" The others smirked, exchanging glances. Lost wasn't the word they were thinking. Vince swung his leg off his bike, adjusting his leather jacket as he stepped forward. He was tall, built like a man who had spent his life fighting, and his presence alone was enough to make most people nervous. But the traveler didn't even acknowledge him. Vince narrowed his eyes. "Hey buddy, you deaf?" The traveler's pace never changed, his boots crunching lightly against the gravel. That annoyed Vince. Nobody ignored him. With a sharp nod, he motioned for his crew to surround the man. The bikers fanned out, cutting off his path, engines idling behind them like growling beasts. The traveler finally stopped. Slowly, he lifted his head, his gaze sweeping over each of them. His eyes were sharp, unnervingly clear, too calm for a man who had just been cornered by a gang. Vince tilted his head. "Well, you got a name, old man?" A long beat of silence stretched between them. Then the traveler finally spoke. "You don't want to do this." His voice was quiet, steady, but there was something wrong about it. Something that made Reed shift uncomfortably before he could stop himself. Vince, on the other hand, barked out a laugh. "Oh yeah? And why is that?" The traveler didn't blink. "Because I'm not who you think I am," Mace scoffed. "That's supposed to scare us?" The traveler sighed, almost like he was disappointed. "No, it's supposed to save you." The bikers exchanged uneasy glances. Something about the way he said it didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like a fact. Vince's smirk faltered for half a second before he recovered. "Cute." He reached out, grabbing the traveler's staff. The second his fingers curled around the wood, a sharp pain shot up his arm. Vince hissed, snatching his hand back. The staff had burned cold, not hot, like he had grabbed a piece of ice that had been sitting in the depths of the ocean. He shook his head, trying to shake off the sudden dizziness that followed. "What the hell?" The traveler tilted his head slightly. "I gave you a chance." His voice was different now. Lower, older, like it didn't belong to a man at all. Mace, still chuckling, didn't notice Vince's hesitation. He reached for the traveler's shoulder and froze. His entire body locked up. His breath hitched, his throat refusing to work. His fingers twitched, but his limbs refused to move. The laughter died in his throat. "Mace?" Reed's voice was unsure. Mace's eyes were wide, panicked, his lips parting as if to speak, but no sound came out. Reed stepped back. "What the hell is happening?" Vince shook his head, scowling. "Stop messing around, Mace." But Mace wasn't messing around. His body began to tremble violently, as if he were standing in the middle of a blizzard. His pupils dilated, his lips turning pale. The traveler finally moved, taking a single step forward. Vince stepped in front of him, hand moving toward the knife at his belt. "I don't know what kind of trick you just pulled, but..." The traveler's gaze snapped to his, and Vince forgot how to breathe. It was like looking into something endless. Something inhuman. Vince staggered back, his vision blurring, a deep coldness spreading through his chest. His mind screamed at him to move, to fight, to do something, but he couldn't. None of them could. The air felt heavier, thicker, pressing against them like a silent storm. The traveler tilted his head slightly, his voice soft. "You were given a chance to walk away. But you didn't take it?" Mace suddenly collapsed, gasping as if he had been held underwater for too long. Reed grabbed him, shaking him. "Mace, what happened?" Mace's hands trembled violently. He looked up at the traveler, his voice barely a whisper. "I saw something." Vince's pulse pounded in his ears. This wasn't possible. Nothing was happening. And yet, he knew something was wrong. The traveler finally smiled. But it wasn't a smirk. It wasn't a threat. It was pity. "You should have left when I warned you." The lights of the rest stop flickered. Then they went out completely. And the darkness swallowed them whole. The darkness was absolute. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of breath, shallow, ragged, uneven. Then a voice. "Light it up," Vince barked. A few of the bikers fumbled for their phones, the dim glow of screens flickering in the void. Shadows stretched long and twisted across the pavement, warping as if the darkness was alive. Reed's hands shook as he switched on his flashlight, his stomach knotting. Where the hell is the power? But no one had an answer. The traveler hadn't moved. He stood in the exact same spot, his silhouette sharp against the weak beams of light, his staff casting an impossibly long shadow. Vince gritted his teeth. Enough of this freak show bullshit. He took a step forward, but the traveler finally spoke. "It won't make a difference." His voice was low, like distant thunder, ancient, steady, unshaken. Vince whipped out his knife. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but you picked the wrong guys to mess with." The traveler exhaled slowly. Then he lifted his staff, just slightly, just enough that the tip scraped against the pavement. The sound it made wasn't natural. It wasn't wood against stone. It was a deep, resonant hum, something that vibrated through the ground, through their bones, through their minds. And suddenly, the air wasn't the same. The temperature plummeted. The dry summer heat of the highway rest stop vanished, replaced with a cold so sharp it cut into their skin. Reed sucked in a breath, his teeth chattering. What the hell is this?" The traveler's eyes reflected the light from their flashlights, but the glow wasn't natural. It was as if something deep, deep inside of him was awake now. Watching. Vince's grip tightened on the knife. He had been in a lot of bad situations. Bar fights, gang wars, even a stint in a foreign prison. He had never been afraid. But now, something inside him, something primal, was telling him to run. And then, as if reading his thoughts, the traveler spoke again. "You wanted to test me." The wind shifted. The trees lining the rest stop bent unnaturally, their leaves rustling with a whisper that sounded almost like laughter. "Now you will see." Mace suddenly let out a strangled scream. Everyone spun toward him and froze. Mace was standing but not standing. His feet were on the ground, but his eyes were wide, unfocused, pupils blown. His entire body was locked in place, his chest barely rising and falling. His mouth opened as if he was screaming, but no sound came out. Reed's breath hitched. "Mace? Mace? What's wrong?" Mace didn't answer, but his eyes were seeing something. Something none of them could see. Vince grabbed his collar, shaking him. "Snap out of it, man." But Mace couldn't move. The traveler tilted his head slightly. Then he lifted his hand. Mace dropped to his knees. And suddenly he was gasping, choking, sobbing. His entire body shook violently, his fingers digging into the gravel like he was trying to claw his way out of something. He coughed so hard he nearly retched. His breaths were uneven, sharp, terrified. Vince grabbed him again. What the hell just happened? Mace's lips trembled. He couldn't answer. His throat worked uselessly, his eyes still locked onto something only he could see. Finally, he managed to whisper, voice hoarse and broken. "I saw it." Vince's patience snapped. "Saw what?" Mace's breath shuddered. I saw my own death. The words hit the gang like a gunshot. Silence crashed over them. And in that silence, the traveler took one step forward. Vince stepped back before he could stop himself. The traveler's eyes found him again. And suddenly, Vince wasn't looking at a man. He was looking at something else. Something that shouldn't exist. Now, the traveler murmured, "Who else would like to see?" The rest stop felt smaller. The darkness felt heavier. And for the first time in his life, Vince wanted to run. Vince's fingers twitched around the handle of his knife, but for the first time, he wasn't sure if he should use it. His breath came in short bursts, chest tightening under an invisible weight. The rest of the gang stood frozen, their cocky grins long gone. Mace was still on his knees, gasping, his hands clutching at his chest like he was trying to pull something unseen off of him. His pupils were blown wide, his skin pale under the dim glow of their flashlights. He wasn't just scared. He was broken. Reed swallowed hard, his throat dry. "What did you do to him?" The traveler's head tilted slightly, like he found the question amusing. "I simply showed him what he was already on the path to." Vince grabbed Mace's jacket, shaking him hard. "Get up, man. Get up." Mace didn't respond. His lips moved, trembling, forming silent words. He looked like he was trying to say something, but his voice was still trapped in his throat. Reed crouched beside him, shaking. "Stillman, talk to me." Finally, after a long moment, Mace's voice scraped out, raw and weak. Falling, his body trembled violently, his breath shuddering. I saw myself falling. My bike, metal twisting. My blood on the road. Reed stiffened. Vince's grip on his knife tightened. Mace's voice cracked as he continued. I felt it. I felt my ribs snap. I tried to breathe, but he swallowed hard, shaking his head. His hands reached out, shaking violently, as if he were still trying to grab onto something that wasn't there. I saw myself die. No one spoke. The wind picked up, kicking up dust and gravel, swirling it around their boots. The traveler watched them silently. Vince forced himself to stand taller, to shove the fear down into the pit of his stomach. "This is bull. Just some freak mind game. I don't know how you're doing this, but..." The traveler took another step forward. Vince stumbled back. A slow smile curved the traveler's lips. "You believe that?" Reed whispered, "Vince, let's go." Vince's jaw clenched. He couldn't leave. He wouldn't. That would mean losing. His fingers twitched, heart hammering. Enough of this. He lunged. The blade flashed under the dim light, aiming straight for the traveler's side. But the moment the knife should have connected, it passed straight through. Vince felt the shift before his brain could process what had happened. The weight of his knife disappeared. The traveler wasn't there anymore. Or rather, he was. But not in a way that made sense. Vince's body locked up, his arms suddenly heavy, his pulse pounding in his ears. A ringing filled his skull, his vision blurring at the edges. Then a whisper, right against his ear. "You were the one who wanted a fight." Vince's entire body seized. The world around him faded, the rest stopped, the bikes, the gang. Everything disappeared into a vast, endless darkness. He was falling. Wind rushed past him, roaring in his ears. His body plummeted through nothingness, the cold air slicing against his skin, his lungs locked, unable to scream. The speed increased, faster, faster. Then, in a split second, the darkness morphed. He was on his bike. Not here. Somewhere else. Some other night. The road stretched ahead of him, slick with rain, his headlights illuminating nothing but darkness. Something was wrong. His fingers gripped the handlebars, but they weren't responding. His brakes were gone. The bike lurched forward, speeding faster, faster, faster. A sharp turn. No way to slow down. The pavement came too fast. A blur of pain, metal, a wet snap. His own voice screaming as the world shattered. Silence. Vince's body jerked violently as he was yanked back into the present. He was on the ground, gasping, his chest heaving like he had been drowning. His gang was staring at him. Reed looked pale, eyes wide with horror. "Vince, what did you see?" Vince's breath shuddered. His arms felt numb. His fingers twitched uncontrollably. He swallowed. I saw my death. Mace was still shaking. Reed's hands clenched into fists, knuckles white. Vince struggled to push himself up, his body unsteady. His gaze snapped to the traveler, rage and terror twisting together. What the hell are you? The traveler smiled. I am simply a man on a journey. Vince forced himself onto his feet, ignoring the way his legs threatened to buckle. This is some kind of trick. The traveler's expression didn't change. But then, his voice did. It was no longer deep and human. It was something ancient, something that vibrated through their bones. Does it feel like a trick? The wind howled. The ground seemed to shift beneath them. And suddenly, they were all too afraid to move. The traveler lowered his staff. The cold in the air began to lift. The lights of the rest stop flickered back on. The traveler turned away from them as if he had already lost interest. Go home. Vince's fists clenched, his pride screaming at him to fight back. To prove he wasn't scared. But his body, his instincts, told him otherwise. He had already lost. The gang scrambled for their bikes. No one said a word. Engines roared to life. Tires skidded against gravel. One by one, they peeled away, their bikes disappearing into the dark stretch of highway. Vince was the last to move. He stared at the traveler for one final moment, his breath still uneven. He wanted to say something, but no words came. Instead, he climbed onto his bike. And he left. The travelers stood alone in the silence, watching their taillights vanish into the night. Then, without a word, he turned and continued walking, his staff tapping lightly against the pavement. The world around him shifted once more, bending, flickering. And then, like a whisper in the wind, he was gone. The road stretched endlessly in front of Vince, the roar of his bike barely drowning out the pounding in his skull. His fingers gripped the handlebars too tightly, his knuckles aching, but he couldn't loosen his hold. Not after what had just happened. Mace rode beside him, silent, hunched over as if trying to outrun whatever nightmare had crawled inside his head. Behind them, the rest of the gang followed, their formation looser than usual, their usual confidence shattered. No one spoke. No one even glanced at each other. Because they all knew the truth. They had just come face to face with something they couldn't explain. Something they weren't supposed to understand. Vince's mind raced. His body still felt wrong, like the cold had seeped into his bones and refused to leave. His heart was beating, but it felt out of rhythm, like a clock that had been knocked out of sync. That man, if he even was a man, had looked into them, had seen them in a way no one ever had before. And what he had shown them, Vince gritted his teeth. He wouldn't let himself believe it. It was a trick. It had to be. But then, why couldn't he shake the feeling that his life had just been rewritten in ways he didn't understand? Reed's voice crackled through his earpiece. Vince. Vince didn't respond. Reed hesitated before speaking again. Where are we going? It was a stupid question. The answer had always been obvious, forward. The road was always ahead, stretching, waiting, an unbroken path they had followed for years. But now it felt like the road was leading somewhere they weren't supposed to go. Vince swallowed hard, forcing his voice to stay steady. We stick to the plan. Keep riding. No one argued. No one agreed either. Mace shifted uncomfortably. You think he's still back there? Reed let out a shaky breath. I don't think it matters. Vince forced himself to focus. The road, the wind, the engine beneath him, the things that had always kept him grounded. But the farther they rode, the heavier his chest felt. Like something was still watching them. They rode for miles, cutting through the night, headlights slicing across the empty highway. The rest stop was far behind them now, a memory they should have been able to leave in the dust. But it didn't feel gone. It felt closer, like they had never really left. Reed's voice broke the silence again. Vince, something's wrong. Vince's patience snapped. No kidding. No, I mean, Reed's voice hitched. Look behind you. Vince hesitated. Then slowly he turned his head. His breath caught. The rest stop was still there. It was impossible. They had been riding for over an hour. It should have been miles behind them, swallowed by the darkness. And yet, There was the same dim glow of the streetlights, the same flickering neon sign, the same stretch of pavement where the traveler had stood, waiting. Vince's blood turned to ice. "This isn't happening," Mace whispered. But it was. The road had looped. Maybe something had never let them leave in the first place. Reed's breathing came fast through the speaker. "Tell me I'm seeing things." No one answered, because they were all seeing it. Vince slowed his bike, the others following suit. Their engines idled, growling against the quiet night. Mace wiped a hand down his face. What the hell is going on? Vince scanned the area, trying to rationalize, trying to find anything that made sense. Nothing did. His skin prickled. He could feel something pressing in, something wrong. A shadow moved near the rest stop. Vince's stomach dropped. The traveler was still there, standing in the exact same spot, watching. Reed let out a curse. No, we left. The traveler didn't move, didn't blink, didn't react at all. It was like he had never even noticed them leave, like time itself had stopped. Vince's mouth went dry. He forced his voice past the tightness in his throat. "We ride." No hesitation this time. Engines roared to life. They turned, accelerating hard, pushing their bikes faster than ever before. The highway blurred past them, the lines stretching under the glow of their headlights. Faster, faster. Vince kept his eyes forward. He didn't look back. He couldn't. But the feeling was still there. That awareness. That weight in the air. They were being followed. Not by cars. Not by police. By something else. Something older. Something that had no need for wheels or roads. Mace's voice broke through the static. "How do we get out of this?" Vince didn't have an answer. But something deep in his gut told him they weren't meant to get out. The lights of a small town appeared on the horizon. Relief crashed into Vince's chest. They just had to make it there. Get to people. Get to anything that felt real. He didn't slow down until they reached the edge of town, their tires skidding against the pavement as they pulled into a gas station parking lot. The fluorescent lights above them buzzed softly, flickering, but the town was alive. People, cars, civilization. They had made it. Vince exhaled hard, running a hand through his hair, trying to catch his breath. Mace slid off his bike, pacing. What the hell just happened back there? No one answered. Reed's hands shook as he pulled off his helmet. "We left him behind, right?" Vince didn't respond. He turned, scanning the parking lot, the street, the town beyond it. And for the first time since they had pulled in, he felt alone. The weight was gone. The pressure in the air had lifted. The traveler wasn't here. They were safe, at least for now. Mace swallowed. "What do we do?" Vince's jaw clenched. He had spent his whole life thinking he was untouchable, that nothing could scare him, nothing could stop him. But tonight had changed something. He didn't know what the traveler was, didn't know what he wanted, but he knew one thing for sure. They had made it out this time. Next time, maybe they wouldn't be so lucky. Vince sat on the curb outside the gas station, his head in his hands, elbows resting on his knees. The roar of their bikes had died down, leaving only the distant hum of passing cars and the faint murmur of voices from inside the convenience store. The normalcy of it all felt wrong, like they had stepped into a different reality altogether. Mace was still pacing, his boots scraping against the pavement. He had lit a cigarette with shaking hands, but he wasn't smoking it, just holding it, staring at the burning ember at the tip. Reed leaned against his bike, his helmet still clutched in his arms. His knuckles were white, his breathing too fast, too shallow. No one spoke, because no one knew what to say. Vince finally forced himself to lift his head. He glanced toward the station, where the fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered against the night. Inside, a cashier leaned against the counter, scrolling through her phone, completely unaware that just miles away, something unnatural had wrapped itself around them. Vince's fingers twitched. He wanted to believe they had escaped. But deep in his gut, he knew better. Mace exhaled, finally breaking the silence. "Someone tell me what the hell just happened?" No one answered. Because how the hell were they supposed to? Reed rubbed a hand down his face, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like his teeth might crack. I don't get it. We left. We rode as fast as we could. So why? He trailed off, shaking his head. Why do I still feel like he's here? Mace muttered something under his breath, barely audible. Vince frowned. What? Mace finally turned, his face pale under the neon lights. He let us go. The words hung between them, thick and heavy, suffocating in their weight. Vince's stomach twisted. No, he shook his head, pushing himself to his feet. No, we got out. Did we? Mace snapped. His voice cracked, his cigarette dropping from his fingers. Think about it. We were stuck. That highway looped us back to that damn rest stop. Over and over. And then, suddenly, we just got out? Reed shuddered. He let us go. Mace nodded slowly, the horror of it sinking deeper into his bones. Vince clenched his jaw. Why? No one had an answer. And that was the worst part. Because what if it wasn't over? What if this was just part of the game? Reed turned suddenly, pushing off his bike. I need to make a call. Vince's brows furrowed. To who? Does it matter? Reed's voice was sharp, panicked. I just need to hear someone real. He fumbled with his phone, pacing toward the edge of the lot. Just give me a second. Vince watched him go, something uneasy curling in his chest. Mace crossed his arms, his body still tense. What do we do, Vince? For the first time in his life, Vince didn't know. He was the leader, the one everyone looked to when things got rough. But this wasn't something he could fight. This wasn't a bar brawl or a gang war. This was something else entirely. Something bigger than them. Something that had chosen them. Vince forced himself to focus. We stick together. We get to a motel, lock the doors, and we figure this out. Mace exhaled. Yeah, but neither of them moved. Because deep down, they both knew. Locking the door wasn't going to stop him. A gust of wind rushed through the parking lot, colder than before. Vince glanced up, instinct tightening in his chest. And then he noticed it. Reed was too far away. When had he walked so far from the station? Vince took a step forward, his heart suddenly hammering against his ribs. Reed? Reed didn't turn around. He was standing near the road now, his phone pressed to his ear. But something was wrong. His shoulders were stiff. His head was tilted at an unnatural angle, like he was listening too hard. Mace noticed too. Reed? Nothing. The phone slipped from Reed's fingers. It hit the pavement with a dull thud, the screen still glowing. Vince didn't think. He just ran. The moment he reached Reed, he grabbed his shoulder and spun him around. Reed's face was white as a corpse. His pupils were huge, swallowing the color of his eyes. His lips parted, trembling. And then, in a hoarse, broken whisper, he spoke. He's here. Vince's body locked up. Reed's breath shuddered. I heard his voice. On the phone. Mace swore, running up behind them. What the hell are you talking about? Reed shook violently. I called my sister. I called her. His breathing was ragged. But it wasn't her voice. It was his. He answered. Vince's blood ran cold. Reed suddenly lurched forward, grabbing Vince's jacket with both hands. His grip was too strong, too desperate. His voice cracked. We never left. Vince's throat went dry. Reed's eyes glassed over, his pupils still too wide, too wrong. And then, the lights in the parking lot flickered. Twice. Then everything went dark. The silence that followed was unnatural. Thick, suffocating. Vince felt his breath catch in his throat, his hands curling into fists. And then, a voice. Not Reed's. Not Mace's. Not his own. It came from right behind them. Steady. Come. You weren't supposed to run. Vince turned. And there he was. Standing in the middle of the parking lot. The traveler. Smiling. Like he had been waiting for them all along. The darkness swallowed the gas station whole. The hum of electricity vanished, the distant sounds of the town fading into nothing. The world around them felt smaller, like it had folded in on itself, trapping them in a space that wasn't meant to exist. Vince's breath came too fast, too shallow. His fingers twitched at his sides, his instincts screaming at him to move, to fight, to run. But he knew. There was nowhere left to go. The traveler stood perfectly still in the center of the parking lot. His expression was unreadable, his hands resting lightly on the top of his staff. He hadn't moved, but somehow, he had never left. Reed shuddered violently, his breaths ragged. "Oh, no, this isn't real." His hands clutched his own arms, his fingers digging in like he was trying to ground himself. Mace swallowed hard, his voice coming out tight. What do you want from us?" The traveler finally blinked. "What I've always wanted." His voice was steady, deep, like distant thunder on the horizon. "To teach." Vince's jaw clenched. "Teach what?" The traveler's lips curled slightly, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "That you are nothing." A breath of wind rushed through the parking lot, cold as ice, carrying whispers that didn't belong to this world. Vince felt it this time. Not fear. Something worse. Something deeper. Recognition. Like a memory he had buried so far down that it had only resurfaced now. The traveler wasn't just a man. He wasn't a ghost. He was something older. Something that had been watching them for a long, long time. Reed suddenly gasped. His body arched, his hands flying to his head as if something was digging into his skull. "Stop, stop." His words cut off into a choked cry. Vince grabbed him, shaking him hard. "What's happening?" Reed's head snapped up, his pupils still too wide, his entire body trembling. "I see it," he whispered, voice cracked raw. "I see all of it." Then, his breath hitched, his eyes locking onto the traveler with something close to reverence. "You're not real." The traveler tilted his head slightly. "Not in the way you understand." Mace suddenly stumbled backward, his face draining of color. "No, this ain't happening." The traveler's gaze shifted toward him. And then, Mace screamed. It wasn't a normal scream. It was pure, raw terror. Like something had reached into him and pulled out everything he had ever feared. He dropped to his knees, his hands pressed against his ears, his entire body shaking. I don't want to see it." Vince moved toward him, but the traveler lifted a hand. And suddenly, Vince couldn't move. His muscles locked, his breath caught in his chest. And then, the world shifted. The gas station vanished. The town disappeared. There was only darkness. And then, he was somewhere else. The roar of an engine beneath him. The weight of his leather jacket pressing against his shoulders. The wind howled. The road stretched before him. He was back on his bike. Back on the highway. But something was wrong. His hands, they weren't on the handlebars. He tried to grab them, tried to steer. But he couldn't move. The speed increased. Faster. 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 He saw the curve ahead. His gut twisted. He knew this road. He knew this moment. And then, the realization hit him. This was how he died. His heart slammed against his ribs, his pulse pounding in his ears. He tried to scream, but no sound came. The tires screeched. Metal crunched. His body twisted. Pain exploded through him, white hot and unbearable. And then, nothing. Just silence. But a voice. "Do you understand now?" Vince's eyes snapped open. He was back in the parking lot. Back in the present. But his body still ached. The phantom pain of a death that hadn't happened yet. He gasped, his chest rising and falling too fast. His vision swam. The traveler stood in front of him, staring down with something almost close to pity. "You all believe you're untouchable. That the road belongs to you. That power is something you take." Vince tried to speak, but his throat was raw. The traveler stepped closer. "But power isn't something that belongs to men like you." His voice was calm, steady. "It belongs to those who understand what it means to be small." Mace let out another sob, his hands tangling in his hair. Reed had stopped shaking, but his face was blank. Empty. Like something had been taken from him. Vince swallowed hard, forcing words out. What do you want from us?" The traveler smiled. "Nothing at all." Turned. And just like that, the lights flickered back on. The gas station returned. The sounds of the town flooded back in. Like nothing had ever happened. Mace let out a shaky breath, curling in on himself. Reed stared blankly at the ground. Vince's heart was still racing. The traveler was walking away, disappearing into the night. Vince's mouth was dry, his pulse hammering in his ears. He wanted to say something, to demand answers. But deep down, he already knew. They were never supposed to meet him. They had been given a lesson. And the worst part? They were never going to forget it. The traveler took his last step off the curb, his body blending into the shadows of the road. He was gone, like he had never been there at all. The silence stretched. Then Mace let out a long, shaking breath. What the hell just happened? Reed swallowed, still looking at the pavement. His voice was soft. We met something we weren't supposed to meet. Vince exhaled, his hands still shaking. And for the first time in his life, he had no idea where to go next. The road had always been his home. But now he wasn't sure he ever wanted to ride again. And somehow, he knew that was exactly what the traveler wanted. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Vince could still feel the weight in his chest, the phantom grip of something unseen holding him in place. His heartbeat had slowed, but his body still ached like it had been torn apart and put back together wrong. Mace was on the curb, his head in his hands, his breathing shallow. His cigarette had burned down to the filter, forgotten. His hands trembled against his knees, his shoulders hunched like a man who had just seen the edge of something he was never supposed to witness. Reed hadn't spoken in minutes. He was sitting against his bike, staring at nothing, his pupils still too wide, his lips parted like he was trying to remember how to breathe. The gas station looked the same as it had before. The world had gone back to normal, but they hadn't. Vince exhaled, slow and shaky. "We need to leave." Mace let out a bitter laugh, low and humorless. "And go where?" Vince didn't answer, because for the first time in his life, he didn't know. The road had always been their escape, their freedom. Now it felt like a noose. Reed finally moved, rubbing his hands over his face, his breath coming in short bursts. "He let us go." His voice was raw, empty. "We were never in control. He just let us go." Vince clenched his jaw, his fists tightening. "Then we forget this ever happened?" Reed's head snapped up. His eyes were wild, unhinged. "Forget? You think we can just forget?" His voice rose, breaking slightly. "That thing, that wasn't a man. That wasn't." Mace shoved a hand toward him, his face pale. "Don't say it." Reed laughed, a high, panicked sound. "But, think he's still listening?" No one answered, because none of them were sure he wasn't. Mace licked his lips, his fingers twitching as he tried to light another cigarette. He fumbled with the lighter, his hands too unsteady. "Maybe we just leave the bikes for a while. Lay low." Vince snapped his gaze toward him. "What?" Mace exhaled. "Think about it, man. We stay on the road, and what if we end up back there? Back at that stop? You want to risk that?" Vince's stomach twisted. The thought of riding, of feeling the wind against his face, of hearing the roar of his engine, it should have brought him comfort. It didn't. Instead, it made his skin crawl. Reed let out another hollow laugh. "So that's it? Just, what? Quit?" Mace swallowed. "Maybe." Vince stood suddenly, his hands curling into fists. "No." Mace looked up at him, exhaustion in his gaze. "Vince." "No," Vince snapped. His chest was tight, his breathing uneven. "We don't let this stop us. We don't let him. Whatever the hell he was, take this from us." His voice shook, but he forced it to steady. "We get back on the bikes and we ride." Reed scoffed. "And go where?" Vince stared at the dark stretch of highway beyond the gas station, the road that had always felt endless. Now it just looked like a trap. He swallowed. "Anywhere." But the word felt hollow. Reed pushed himself up, shaking his head. "Man, screw this. I'm done." Mace looked over at him, brows furrowing. "Done." Reed laughed again, but there was no humor left in it. "Yeah, done. I'm not riding anymore. I'm not risking that again." His hands twitched, his breath hitched. You didn't hear him. His voice, he swallowed, shaking his head. "I can't. I won't." Mace didn't argue. And that was what scared Vince the most. He grabbed Reed's arm, his grip tight, desperate. "We don't just quit." Reed wrenched away, his expression hard. "Maybe you don't," he exhaled sharply. "But I'm not gonna end up like Mace. Or like you." Vince stiffened. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" Reed tilted his head slightly. "You saw something too, didn't you?" Vince's stomach clenched. "Shut up." Reed stepped forward. "You did, didn't you? You saw the same damn thing we did." Vince's throat tightened. The bite, the crash, the feeling of falling, the way his body had broken before the world had gone black. He hadn't told them, but they knew. Reed shook his head, disgust flickering in his expression. "Keep riding if you want, but I'm done." He turned and walked away. Vince's breath hitched. "Where the hell are you gonna go?" Reed didn't answer, didn't look back, just kept walking, like the road had never meant anything at all. Mace sat back down on the curb, exhaling long and slow. "Guess that makes two of us." Vince stared at him. "You too?" Mace gave a weak, lopsided smile. "I'm not an idiot. I know what I saw. I know what I felt." His fingers twitched against his knee. "I don't think we were meant to walk away from that." Vince clenched his fists. "But we did." Mace looked up at him. "Did we?" Vince's throat went dry. Mace stood, stretching. "I'm heading into town. Gonna find a motel. Figure out what's next." He hesitated. "You should come with." Vince shook his head. Mace sighed. "Didn't think so." And just like that, he left too. Vince was alone. For the first time in years. The road had always been his home. His escape. His life. But now it just felt like a coffin waiting to close. The streetlights buzzed above him. The world had moved on. The traveler was gone. But Vince knew that didn't mean he was free. He turned toward his bike, his hands shaking as he reached for the handlebars. The metal was ice cold, like it had been waiting for him. Vince exhaled, steadying himself. Then, slowly, he swung his leg over the seat. The engine rumbled to life. The sound was familiar, comforting, but it didn't feel the same. Not anymore. The highway stretched before him, dark and endless. He hesitated. For the first time in his life, Vince wasn't sure if he wanted to ride. But deep down he knew, the moment his tires hit the pavement, the moment he let the road take him, he wouldn't be riding alone. Because the traveler wasn't finished with him yet. Maybe he never would be. The rumble of the engine filled the empty night, but it didn't drown out the thoughts in Vince's head. The road stretched ahead, endless and dark, just like it always had. The familiar feeling of the wind rushing past him, the steady vibration of the Harley beneath him, should have brought comfort. It didn't. Not anymore. Not after what had happened. The town was long behind him now. Mace had stayed behind. Reed was gone. The gang, the Black Vultures, was dead in everything but name. And Vince? He had done what he always did. He rode. Because that's what he had always known. But something felt wrong. The road was too empty. The air too still. His chest too heavy. Like he had made a mistake just by getting back on the bike. He shook the thought away, forcing his focus forward. This was just his head messing with him. Just fear trying to crawl its way into his bones. But fear didn't belong to him. He had never been afraid before. So why did he feel like something was watching him? The highway signs flashed past, mile after mile disappearing behind him. He was heading west. Just riding. No destination, just movement. That was the only way to shake this feeling. Keep moving. Don't stop. Never stop. But then, something changed. It was small at first. The air turned colder. The bike vibrated differently beneath him. Like the wheels weren't quite touching the pavement anymore. Like the road itself had shifted. He glanced down at his speedometer. It was dead. The needle sat at 0. Even though he was still moving. His stomach twisted. He took a deep breath, gripping the handlebars tighter. His pulse was steady. His thoughts were clear. He wasn't losing it. This was real. And then, the headlights flickered. For a split second, the darkness ahead was total. And in that instant he saw it. A figure, standing in the middle of the road. His heart seized. His muscles locked. But before he could react, the lights came back. The road was empty. Nothing was there. Vince gritted his teeth. His breath was sharp, uneven. His pulse hammered in his ears. He shook his head. No, he was imagining things. And then, he saw the sign. It stood at the edge of the highway, faded and rusted, barely visible in the dark. A sign he had seen before. A sign he shouldn't be seeing. Rest stop, 2 miles. His grip on the handlebars tightened painfully. No, this wasn't happening. He had been riding for hours. That rest stop should have been hundreds of miles behind him. But there it was. Waiting. Just ahead. His stomach twisted, nausea rising in his throat. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. He gunned the throttle, pushing the engine to its limit, forcing the bike to fly down the road. The lines on the pavement blurred beneath him, the wind howling in his ears. Faster! Faster! Get away! And yet, the rest stop sign flashed past him. The turnoff was right there. Just like before. Vince's pulse skipped. His fingers went numb. No, he hadn't just looped. That was impossible. He kept going, pushing forward. The highway stretched on. Endless. Empty. And then, another sign appeared. Rest stop, 2 miles. His breath hitched. His stomach curled in on itself. This was happening. He slammed the brakes. The tires screeched against the pavement, the bike skidding as he fought to control it. When he finally stopped, the air was too silent. The world too still. He was alone. Or at least, he thought he was. A voice. Even. Familiar. You weren't supposed to ride again. Vince's blood ran cold. He turned slowly, and there he was. Standing right behind him. The traveler. Same robes. Same staff. Same unreadable expression. Like he had been waiting. Like he had always been waiting. Vince's breath was shallow. His body frozen. His heart pounded. He forced words past his dry throat. What do you want from me? The traveler took a single step forward, and Vince's vision blurred. The road around them vanished. The world twisted. And suddenly, he was back on his bike. Riding. But not here. Not now. Somewhere else. Some other time. He knew this road. He knew this night. It was before. Before the traveler. Before everything. His heart slammed against his ribs. Not this. He knew where this led. He tried to stop. Tried to slow down. But his hands, his body, wouldn't move. He was trapped. Stuck inside the memory. Forced to relive it. The turn was coming. The slick pavement. The sharp curve. The mistake. The crash. He screamed. But there was nothing he could do. The moment came. The tires slid. The world tilted. And then, darkness. Vince gasped, snapping back. He was on his knees. The traveler stood over him, watching. Waiting. Vince's entire body shook. He felt it. The pain. The impact. Even though it hadn't happened. Not yet. The traveler crouched in front of him. His voice was quiet. You were never supposed to leave. Vince's breath shuddered. His hands curled into fists. What are you? The traveler smiled. And this time, it wasn't kind. You already know. Vince swallowed. Because he did. Deep down, he had known from the start. He wasn't supposed to survive that night. He was supposed to crash. To die. But something had changed. Something had let him walk away. And now it was here to fix that mistake. Vince's chest ached. His vision swam. The traveler stood, his shadow stretching long in the moonlight. This is where your road ends. Vince forced himself up, his legs trembling. No, the traveler's head tilted. You think you have a choice? Vince's breath was ragged. His fingers twitched. He had spent his whole life believing he was in control, that he was the one calling the shots. But he wasn't sure anymore. The traveler turned, walking back toward the road. And something in Vince's gut told him, if he let him go, if he didn't stop him now, he'd never get another chance. He moved. His body lurched forward, his hand grabbing the traveler's wrist. The moment he touched him, everything stopped. The air, the road, the sound of the wind, even time itself. And then, the traveler turned his head. His eyes were not human, not even close. Vince's breath hitched. And then, everything went dark.